Hi, I'm Iain and welcome to the Northland Workshop. Some people have a whole collection of antique hand planes that are near and dear to their heart. I happen to have a corner filled with pocket hole jigs, to the point that I actually call this area of the workshop the corner, and that's spelled with a K due to the massive amount of Kreg stuff in here, including a Kreg banner. Now, I don't want you to think I'm sponsored by them because they have no idea who I am. I ended up buying all this stuff on my own. Some of it were birthday presents, stuff like that, but none of it came from Kreg directly. They had no idea I exist. So, what I figured I would do with this collection is make a series of videos showing different jigs throughout the years and how to use them to the best of their ability. So if you happen to have one of these jigs, you can use it in your projects. So today we're going to start out with the oldest series of jigs I own, which are the K series of jigs. These are all K2 jigs, and we're going to go over how to set them up to use them in 1/2 inch thick wood, 3/4 inch thick wood, and 1.5 inch thick wood. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 3 K2 jigs I have, the differences in them during their production run, and then how to actually use them in a project. So here we have my 3 K2 jigs, and the K2 jig started out life in the early 90s when Kreg could no longer keep up with demand with their M2 jig. Now their M2 jig was their first aluminum 2-hole jig, that's where the 2 came from, and it was a sand cast aluminum jig. That means the mold was actually made out of sand, and then they would pour the aluminum in, it would set up, they'd take it apart, the sand would just crumble away, and they would have to put the form back in it and remake the mold every single time, which is time consuming. So, as demand of pocket hole jigs increased, they went to what's called a die cast, and this is the die cast jig. You can tell the M2 and the K2 apart because the M2 doesn't have this relief in the back. It's just a solid mass of aluminum. It's a solid mass of aluminum on the bottom, and there's no joint right here. You'll notice with this one, there's a seam right there, and it's held together with 2 very coarse threaded screws, because for the die cast process, the bottom was cast as one piece, the drill guide was cast as another, and then it was simply screwed together. Whereas the M2, it was all cast in one big shape. So, these are 3 iterations of the K2, starting with the earliest. The earliest one has a smooth top. There are no alignment marks to be able to line up where the center of the hole is going to be. It's just smooth. The other thing you'll notice, there are no chip ejection holes in it. That slows down drilling a little bit because the flutes of the drill bit load up with chips, and a lot of times you have to pull the bit out and plunge it in again in order to clean out the chips. So this was the first iteration. Here we have a mid-run K2. Now, there's another thing that's a little different about this K2, and that is it has the optional Kreg air clamp to it and the little foot pedal. You would put this on the floor. When you step on it, compressed air would push that plunger down, clamp the workpiece up against the drill guide, and you'd be able to drill the holes, take your foot off the pedal, and it would release. It works really well for big plywood panels, or if you have a lot of holes to drill, because you're not fighting with the front mount toggle clamp. Well, this, besides the air clamp, you can tell is a mid-run pocket hole jig because it has these raised alignment marks in here, so that way if you draw lines on the workpiece, you can line up the center of the hole with those lines. It's not a later production one because it still doesn't have the chip ejection holes here we have the latest version of the K2. You'll notice it has the raised alignment marks and it has the holes drilled in it for the sawdust to come out. So this is what it ultimately became before it switched to the fiberglass reinforced plastic jigs. So you can see the different evolution of it, and the neat thing with this one is the air clamp that I really like. Any of these jigs, if you get them at a yard sale or on eBay, they are fantastic jigs. They work really well. Even the ones without the holes for the sawdust to come out, it's okay too. So I would recommend any of these. First thing we have to accept with the K2 jig is it was designed for drilling pocket holes in 3/4 inch thick wood, which, let's face it, is usually the size wood that one drills pocket holes in. Yes, it can be set up for 1/2 inch. We'll set it up for 1/2 inch in just a minute, but it really is primarily designed for 3/4 inch thick wood. So, in order to set it up, what you do is you take the drill bit and loosen up the stop collar on it, so that way it can slide, and you take a nickel and you put the pilot bit down on the nickel and then simply tighten down the stop collar. And you want to make the stop collar set screw pretty snug because they have a tendency to want to move over time. So again, the distance of the nickel, there it is. The pilot hole is not supposed to poke all the way through the wood. If it's coming through the wood, you're also drilling into the jig. And you can see this one has made it almost 30 years without any blemishes in it. So I'd like to try and keep that record as long as I can. With the drill bit now in the drill, we can go ahead and set up the toggle clamp to hold the 3/4 inch thick piece of wood in place. And the easiest way to do that is to loosen up this nut and adjust this little foot until you get it so you have firm pressure, but not so much that you snap off the jig right here. That's a little excessive. There we go. Again, you want it pushed hard enough that it's not going to shift as you drill, but you don't want to have to put a piece of pipe on this handle to get enough leverage to push it down. Once you find that spot, you can go ahead and tighten down that little jam nut so it doesn't move around as you use it. The nice thing about the K2, because it really is designed for 3/4 inch thick wood, chances are once you set that little pressure foot, you're not going to have to adjust it very often. There's really not much to drilling the pocket hole, but there are a couple quick tips, and this applies to any of the jigs. First of all, you really don't want the bit spinning as you try to put it in the hardened drill guide, because again, that drill guide is hardened steel. That way it doesn't wear with the drill bit spinning in it. If you start the drill bit up here, when you put it in, there's a good chance it's going to bind a little bit and the drill guide could actually knock the corners off the drill. So you want to make sure it's in the drill guide before you turn the drill motor on. The other thing is, right now, it's up against the piece of wood. If I pull the trigger, it's going to tear out a great big chunk of wood. I want to lift up on the drill about 1/4 inch, squeeze the trigger, and it's an all or nothing type thing. I want as fast a speed as possible, and then I'll slowly plunge it in. I don't want it to be contacting the wood when I first pull the trigger. And just like that, I get a nice clean pocket hole with a 20-something-year-old jig. And this has way more than 20 years left in it. If I had a spot set up for it, I could simply use the 3 holes and screw it down to a workbench, or like I did with the air-operated one, I just screwed it to a piece of plywood. Now it's time to set up the K2 to drill pocket holes in 1/2-inch thick wood, but like I said before, it's really designed for 3/4 inch. So the manual says I need to make a shim that is 3/8 of an inch thick to put the wood on. So I've gone ahead and I've glued this little piece of wood onto this other 3/8 by 3/8 thick square piece of wood, and that was just cut out of a scrap 1x material I had kicking around. And what I'm going to do is glue this other little piece on, so that way it holds it in place. I can pick it up when I want to use it for regular 3/4 inch thick wood, and I can set it down on when I use it for 1/2 inch, and it'll just keep it from falling off if I'm scooting the workpiece side to side. And to glue it on, all I'm going to use is a little bit of super glue. Put a little bead on there, then just push it together. Once that dries for a couple seconds, I'll simply trim off the excess, and we have ourselves a little spacer. And with the ends trimmed off, I've got the perfect little spacer. Now I need to go ahead and readjust the stop collar on the drill bit. And to do that, I'm going to move the little spacer out to where it just touches, and again I'm going to put the nickel on there, and I can go ahead, loosen up the stop collar and tighten it back down in its new location. And with that in place, I can go ahead, push the spacer all the way back. I'm going to take my 1/2 inch piece of plywood, and as you can see, I need to advance the foot about 1/4 of an inch. That seems good right about there. And again, I'll tighten down the jam nut, and we're good to go. And there we have a hole for a 1/2 inch thick piece of wood. Now, the screw that you're going to want to use for this is a pan head screw, because the regular washer head screw is actually going to stick out above the surface just a little bit. So that's one thing to be aware of. But that's how you set up the K2 for 1/2 inch thick wood. The final thing we're going to want to do is figure out how to drill pocket holes in 2x material, so 1.5 inch thick, like a 2x4. First thing we need to do is reset the bit back to its standard position. Now the manual recommends that for 2x material, because there's no way to really adjust this thing, that you simply drill holes on both sides of the 2x material. So in this case, I'm going to drill 2 holes in this side, spin it around, and drill 2 holes in the other side. So that way you have pocket screws going from both directions. Again, the K2 was really designed for 3/4 inch wood, and everything else is kind of a makeshift solution for it. There's another issue, and the issue that the manual does not address is, even if I max this little pusher foot all the way back as wide open as I can get it, I can't get the clamp to actually go past center and hold itself. So I'm unable to clamp the 2x4 with the toggle clamp on this thing, and the air cylinder on the air-powered one doesn't get any wider than it is right now, so that's completely out of it. So the only thing I can think to do, because I don't want to remove these screws, drill new holes, and re-tap it and have to move that clamp back and forth, is I'll simply provide my own clamp for this operation. So what I'm going to do, and there's a knot we're going to get to drill through, so that should be fun, is simply take the 2x4, put it in place, and I'm going to hold it down and simply clamp it with the first clamp I can find lying around. Now I can go ahead and drill the first pocket hole. Now I just loosen up the clamp, move it over, and I'll use the other hole to drill the other pocket hole. Those look good. Now, following the manual's instructions, I can do the same thing on the other side of the 2x4. There. If I wanted to, I could even put a third hole, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I think that is sufficient. So I hope this video has helped you be able to set up your K2 jig, because there's a lot of them out there. They are very well built, and you can still do quite a bit of work with them, especially if you have a 3/8 spacer and about 5 cents worth of spacer for the drill bit. Now for some maintenance. There's not a whole lot to this jig. There's not a lot you have to do to it, short of getting new drill bits when they get dull. However, there's a couple things that will make it work that much better. In the original manual, they say to put a drop of oil on the drill bit every 250 holes, and that's just to keep the drill guides lubricated. Well, what I found works even better is the spray silicone lubricant. The nice thing about the silicone is it doesn't attract dust, so dust won't cling to it. I also use the silicone on the barrel and the pivot points of the little cam lock, and I use just a little bit of 3-in-1 oil on the threads of the pusher foot. Again, you want to use that stuff sparingly because you don't want it to get on the wood, because that might affect the finish. But what I found is just a little bit of silicone spray on the drill bit, let it dry before I use it, and I've never seen any issues with the finish, and it makes it eject the chips a little bit better, and it just helps the drill guides live longer. So I hope this video has helped you be able to set up your K2 jig really with 5 cents worth of spacers and maybe a little homemade spacer block. If you want to use it for 1/2 inch thick wood, I think you're going to find that you can still get a lot of use out of this older jig, especially since if you find it at a yard sale or a flea market, there's a good chance you're going to get it for a very reasonable price.